I'm Jeremy Parrish, and this is Game Boy World. Yakuman, the last of Nintendo's 4 Japanese launch titles for Game Boy, is remarkable because it's the only one of those 4 that didn't make its way to the West. It's always interesting to look at first-party Nintendo games that remained stuck in Japan, given the company's active efforts to take its video game business international from the very beginning. Was Devil World potentially too offensive for Americans with its very mild religious imagery? Was Fire Emblem deemed too complex? Earthbound Zero too arcane? Captain Rainbow too insensitive? Yeah, probably that latter one. But Nintendo's not saying. With Yakuman, though, there's no mystery. It never came here because it would have been almost completely unsellable in America. Yakuman belongs to the ever-popular Japanese mahjong genre. A straight rendition of Japanese mahjong, Yakuman represents a specific category of game that appears in great numbers in Japan, and Japan alone. Japanese mahjong is a very specific variant on the traditional Chinese tabletop gambling game, and it's insanely complex and nuanced. Truth be told, I don't understand the game myself, and while I spent a few hours reading up on it while putting together this retrospective, I don't feel like I'm really any closer to getting it. I'm working on it though. There'll be many more mahjong games over the course of Game Boy World's life, so we can learn about it together. So I can't really say how effectively Yakuman translates Japanese mahjong to video format, though it does seem to be comparable to contemporary Famicom and arcade games of the type, albeit monochromatic. Now, given the role that color typically plays with mahjong tiles, that seems like it would be fairly detrimental to the play, though maybe not as detrimental as the all katakana text display. The result is that Yakuman is kind of an eyesore. Reading Japanese written in all katakana is kind of like reading English without spacing, punctuation, or capitalization. You can do it, but it's not fun. This wasn't uncommon in old cartridge games due to space limitations. Most early Famicom games just used English. Rockman 2, the Japanese version of Mega Man 2, wrote out its messages from Dr. Light in katakana. Even Final Fantasy IV, which had a very complex and text-heavy story, was originally presented just in hiragana, no kanji. So while there's definitely precedent for Yakuman's approach, it seems worth remarking on here because the unfriendly presentation of Yakuman, both the clunky language and the very limited player interface, to me suggests that it was designed specifically for people who already knew mahjong inside and out. And who would that be? Well, let's be honest, it definitely isn't kids. Or Americans, but never mind that. No, the stereotypical mahjong player is a Yakuza gangster or an elderly Japanese person who's lived well beyond the age of 100 by preserving themselves with a diet consisting entirely of liquor and cigarettes. Mahjong is a game played in dim, smoke-filled parlors late at night, and it usually involves the exchange of money. It's not kid-friendly stuff, and you're about as likely to see Japanese kids clamoring to play Mahjong as you are to see American types lining up to play Texas Hold'em, which is to say, you don't. In other words, despite Game Boy having boy right there in the title, Nintendo actually intended to aim for a broader, older market with the system right from the very beginning. Yakuman made Game Boy the first major standalone game system to launch with a Mahjong title. The closest that had happened prior to this was Shanghai for NEC's PC Engine, the TurboGrafx 16 in Japan. But that's not the same thing at all. Shanghai uses Mahjong tiles, sure, but it's more like a mix of solitaire and a puzzle game than it is poker or, real Mahjong. This skew toward the older gamer actually ties back into Game Boy's primal origins. Nintendo got its start in handheld gaming when Gunpei Yokoi saw a salaryman playing around with a digital watch one night on the train. That inspired him to use wristwatch components to launch the Game & Watch series. Game & Watch begat Game Boy, and right from the start, Game Boy was designed just as much for that watch-obsessed salaryman as it was for kids. Now, I'm not suggesting that Yakuman is the reason why Game Boy was such a huge success. It wasn't. But it's certainly emblematic of the strategy that made the system so popular with all ages around the world. Game Boy was cheap, yeah, and it was affordable for kids and for parents. But it was also a system adults could enjoy. The hardware had a friendly look to it, very kid-friendly. But at the same time, it was also reminiscent somewhat of sophisticated computers. The Game Boy's color scheme and appearance echoed Apple's Snow White design language, perhaps the first instance of Nintendo's long-running tradition of pretty much ripping off Apple hardware design. And of course, Game Boy was home to games like Yakuman, and Tetris, and Heianko Alien, and Boxel, and countless other slow-paced puzzlers that transcended age boundaries and were perfect time killers for people of all demographics. Now, maybe Yakuman wasn't so much about transcending age and language boundaries, but even so, it set the Game Boy down a path of gaming for grown-ups that would serve it well through the years. So while this game is easily forgettable even for, hardcore mahjong fans, what Yakuman represents is very important. It's a sign of smart thinking by Nintendo and great things to come. For more on Game Boy's history, check out GameBoyWorld.com.